Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you all for coming today. And thank you for having me here. My first time in Little Rock. Unfortunately, it's an in and out type of situation, but I glimpsed it from the sky and it looked lovely. So I'm very excited to be here. When I started volunteering in an educational capacity in prisons in New York about 13 years ago, and I would tell people that I was teaching in prison, the average person tended to look at me as if I were insane. And why are you teaching those criminals? Why are you going in there? What are you doing? And I got used to explaining myself. But what I started to notice was that maybe about 4 years ago, much fewer people started to look at me in that way when I said I teach and work in prisons. And that is because I think a massive cultural shift started to happen. And that shift is that it has become widely recognized that mass incarceration is the civil rights issue of our time. And there is no way around that. I think probably many people in this room are familiar with the statistics, so I won't recount too many of them, but the numbers are staggering. We have 2.3 million incarcerated in this country with 5% of the world's population. We have 25% of its prison population. We're spending an estimated $70 billion a year on incarceration, which is 6 times what we spend on higher education. There are more African Americans under criminal supervision than there were slaves at the height of slavery in 1850. The racial disparities in the system begin at the bottom and end all the way at the top, run through our system on every level from courts to parole to reentry. And thanks to works like certainly the new Jim Crow, the film 13th, all of these wonderful works that have brought this into the public domain much more than ever before, there started to be a greater recognition of this reality somewhere around 4 or 5 years ago. But what I noticed is, in the context of that conversation, and at that time, by then I was well into running an education program inside the Prison to College Pipeline, which was mentioned, which is our program at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, where students begin college while in prison and then are guaranteed a slot in CUNY in any university system, really, when they come home. So, of course, the name being a play on this idea of the school to prison pipeline, well, our program is about reversing that flow, and we've funneled dozens of students at this point from prison into college. And so being immersed in all of that and immersed in this discourse, what I started to notice is that there were a couple of things missing from the conversation around mass incarceration. And one of them was, and I think to a great extent still is, the moral dimension of it. There's a lot of conversation around the costs of mass incarceration. In fact, it's one of the things that's led to bipartisan support for changing the system, a recognition that states are going broke over incarcerating people. We cannot afford to take this approach anymore. So a lot of conversations about the economics of it, but what worried me about that conversation is that if it's only about money, we'll find a cheaper way to mass incarcerate. We'll find a cheaper way to exert social control over groups of others and find another way to oppress these groups that we have deemed other. So without talking about the moral dimension, I felt afraid for the future going forward. The other thing that it felt to me was missing was, and again, to a great extent still is, an international context for all of this. So we have 25% of the world's population. That still leaves 75%. There are over 10 million people incarcerated around the world. 3 million of them have been convicted of nothing. And I have to say that number again just to let it sink in. 3 million people languishing in jails awaiting trial for not just 3 years, as some of you know the famous story of Khalif Browder, who sat in Rikers Island for 3 years awaiting trial, and when he came home, killed himself, right? Not just 3 years, but 7 years, 10 years. There are prison systems around the world where upwards of 70, 80, 90% of the population is awaiting trial and thereby potentially completely innocent and having their lives decimated. So a lot of conversation about our crisis, which as well there should be, it's a massive crisis of epidemic proportions, but very little conversation sort of about the international implications of this and what our systems have wrought upon the world. And so what I decided to do was to embark on a project that kind of married these two things, that was a way of looking at the fundamentals of what we do when we build prisons, when we incarcerate, when we punish. What does it mean to respond to crime with prison, which has been pretty much our exclusive response to crime and most countries' exclusive response to crime for a couple hundred years now. And also, how can we think about that by this journey around the world, thinking about the international context? And so that led to my writing the book, Incarceration Nations, and I spent a little over 2 years traveling to 9 countries' prison systems, wherever possible, volunteering, teaching, doing what I could to get as enmeshed in the system as I could in that time. And then came back deliberately looking to write for an audience that was broad, that was bigger than an academic audience, and reaching people who may not have been touched by this in some capacity yet, and who were willing to listen. And the other thing that I became very interested in, and I think especially now, this is something that obsesses me, is trying to think about solutions, trying to not only, and it's not an only, it's quite significant to map out the problem, which I think the new Jim Crow, 13th, do so brilliantly in the context of US mass incarceration, but to get past mapping only problems and really start envisioning solutions and look for pockets of solutions in a global context. And so I began that journey here in Rwanda. This is Kigali Prison in Kigali, Rwanda. And I began the journey in Rwanda because of the one thing that we all associate with Rwanda, which is genocide. Almost 1 million people being killed in less than 90 days. And yet, so obviously a grand and, you know, in a sense, the short-lived nature of the tragedy made it that much more intense in terms of the lived experience of it. And yet Rwanda's famous response to this was quite other than incarceration. Initially, those who committed the genocide were thrown in prisons, but Rwanda is a country that literally did not have the infrastructure to incarcerate everyone who did this. So people, for the first years after the genocide, were rotting on top of each other in prisons, literally, dying of disease. There was just no space, nowhere to put them. And so, in part because of that need, the president, Kagame, responded by approaching this tragedy through restorative justice. And my entry point into this issue, the issue of incarceration, always comes from this context of restorative justice. In other words, how do we put the victim or the survivor back at the center of our justice system, as opposed to the focus on how do we harm/punish the person who did the wrong? And Rwanda seemed the perfect place to sort of start theorizing about that. Now, the Gacaca courts, which were the famous community courts that Kagame established, those were not in effect when I was there. I was there in 2012. There were still trials happening, but we were nearing the end of that. But I was very interested in sort of the next generation of survivors, the young people, aged 20 to 25, who were orphaned by the genocide, who are thus survivors of the genocide, but experience it in a very different way from their parents. And so the time that I spent in Rwanda was with a group called Never Again Rwanda, and it was a youth group, and I worked with a group of young people who wanted to go inside the prisons. Now, approximately 80% of the prison population in Rwanda is in for the crime of genocide. So potentially we're talking about people who could have killed these young people's parents. And they wanted to go in there to confront this crime, to deal with the trauma in some kind of a way. And so I worked with them. We started a project called the Prison Visiting Project. They started it. I was a mere facilitator in that process. And this was a photo that I took on the first day of that. And I think the ultimate takeaway from this experience really has to do with rethinking the needs of survivors. The first question that I'm often asked when I talk about any sort of empathy for people in prison or frustration with incarceration as a system of justice is, but what about the victim? What about the survivor? And my response is always, my concern is precisely for the survivor, for whom a punitive system of justice we see again and again is not bringing the survivor the kind of healing, restitution, reparations that he or she deserves. And the time that I had sort of theorized this before, but the time that I spent in Rwanda was a time to witness that firsthand, working with these young people who really came to a sense of dealing with trauma by way of these visits to Kigali prison. And there are some interesting studies that I won't cite them here, but we can chat afterward if you want to know them. But there are lots of interesting studies done. I've had the privilege of having many conversations with serious crime survivors who have talked to me about the frustrations with the traditional approach to criminal justice, which ultimately just shoves them to the side and focuses on the quote-unquote offender instead of the victim here. And I continued thinking about this in another country that's been seared by both national and individual trauma, and that's South Africa, a country where apartheid was coming to an end just as the genocide was coming to an end, and also had a national reconciliation process, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, on a grand scale to deal with this national evil. And in South Africa, though, what I wanted to do was think about this, press further on this issue of forgiveness, on this issue of restitution, of reparations, of restorative justice, of what a non-punitive justice system could look like, by focusing specifically on the kind of one-to-ones of survivors of the harmed and those who've caused harm. And so I did that in a very notorious prison in South Africa. This is Pollsmoor Prison in Cape Town, South Africa. It is, I sort of think of it as the Rikers Island of the continent because it serves the same function. It's much more of a jail, a remand prison, than a prison. People are there for a time, but they often languish way longer than they're supposed to, for years. It's notoriously violent. It's gang run. The government owes billions of dollars in damages to people who have been incarcerated there for the amount of murders, stabbings, rapes. It's estimated that 1 in 4 individuals is raped there. The TB transmission rate is 90%, so you're going to get TB if you're there. So I could go on and on about the horrors of Pollsmoor. What I actually witnessed there, and what this is a really powerful restorative justice program that is run by an individual. He's a pastor who was formerly incarcerated at Pollsmoor himself, came out, and he and his wife individually started a restorative justice program that's sort of the last bastion of restorative justice programs in a country that was actually saturated with them post-apartheid, but has lost funding, has lost momentum to a great extent. And so what you see here are individuals, you know, men. This happens in the women's prison as well. I took part in the men's prison one, but these are men from the townships. These are literally the, in a sense, the detritus of apartheid. They are the people who could not emerge from that national trauma, and so they're funneled into a prison system, right, in much the way that we see in this country around Black and brown communities. If you notice, there's one white person, one white prisoner in the room. That's pretty much indicative of who the prison population is in South Africa. And I think the greatest takeaways, it was an unbelievably profound experience to witness these men not only recognize the way that they have harmed other people. At the end of this, their family members came in and they had a chance to publicly confront each other. And this is, I mean, we're talking about some of the men who had raped their wives, who had caused unbelievable harm to their families, apologizing, breaking down in tears. But over the course of that week, what they also recognized is the ways in which they have been victimized, both by family trauma, drug abuse in communities, and systemic, obviously systemic racism, systemic violence in communities that were foisted upon them. And so one of the greatest takeaways is that, well, there are two, I think, actually. One is that, number one, when we talk about people in prison as being offenders, we're only telling half the story. And the statistics bear this out. The good bulk of individuals inside prisons have been victimized as well. This is especially true of women, which I'll get to in a moment. But if they have not been victimized by their, literally victimized or harmed by other people, been victims of crimes, they have been harmed by virtue of the nature of systemic poverty and systemic racism that designates certain individuals as going into the system. They have been victims of a whole society stacked against them. And for that reason, the other term that I came to abhor in the time that I spent in Pollsmoor is the term rehabilitation, which we hear thrown around a lot. Because rehabilitation implies that you were habilitated in the first place. And the majority of people in prisons globally, as I've witnessed it, have not been habilitated. They come from communities that were denied opportunities, that are rife with racism and poverty and systems and structures that are stacked against them. So it's really habilitation. We throw around this idea of second chances, but we're really talking about first chances for those who have not been given them at all. I often hear the Second Chance Pell Act is a grant that we got at the Prison to College Pipeline for college programs in prison. And I always laugh at that name because I think about the students in my program, maybe one of them ever had a shot at a good education in the first place. So it's a first chance Pell Act. And I think you see that nowhere more glaringly than in post-apartheid South Africa, one of the most unequal societies in the world. The legacy of the distribution of wealth is galling. I stayed on the continent, and this is from Uganda. This is Luzira Prison in Uganda, some individuals that I taught a creative writing class to, and along the same vein, in terms of the theme that I was looking at, this right here is General Penitentiary in Kingston, Jamaica. And in both these places, what I wanted to look at, after having this foundation of thinking about forgiveness and harm and punishment, and was thinking about sort of what we do in prisons by way of healing. And a lot of what we do, and by we I mean it's prevalent here in the US and around the globe too, is engage in arts programs in prisons. And so I wanted to look at the role of the arts in prisons in very extreme situations. In Luzira, in Uganda, that prison is a prison that was built for 600 and is home to 5,000 men, women, and children. People are literally sleeping standing up. The conditions are, deplorable on every level. Countless individuals are in there because they can't afford a bribe, and that's it. And likewise, this prison, GP in Kingston, where I've now been actually several times, I'm trying to work on a program there, was built for about 600 too, and has almost 2,000, and including children who are illegally there. And in both of these places, in Uganda, I actually started a creative writing program, and here in Jamaica, I looked at a reggae music program that's happening. And ultimately, what I call these programs is Band-Aids on an amputated limb, because what can the arts do in the face of that horror? Yes, I mean, I'm an English professor. I'm all about the power of the arts and the power of the word to give one agency. I think it can be a lifeline in many respects, but the problem is it distracts us from the systemic change that, clearly is necessary when you're talking about an atrocity of this degree. What's interesting about this photo is that when I show it to people, most of the time people will think that it's in upstate New York or somewhere, it could really be anywhere throughout the States, and in fact anywhere throughout the world, which is not an accident. And I think one of the greatest revelations that I learned, and not only learned but witnessed again and again, is the way in which our system and our structure, literally, has been foisted upon the world. This prison was modeled after Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. Over 300 prisons around the world were modeled after Eastern Eastern is considered, Eastern and Auburn in New York are considered the first two modern prisons. And what happened was that this was in the mid-19th century, these leaders from around the world came to see it. It was just considered this awesome feat. And as I actually just learned this on a recent visit to Eastern, that there was running water in Eastern before there was running water in the White House. So we've been leaking money into prisons for quite some time. And so these leaders came, saw this structure, and then built in their countries the same ones, and because of colonialism and then globalization, these proliferated around the globe. And I think there's no more statement of how bereft this system is than to see this structure, right, this Anglified structure in Kigali, Rwanda, in Kingston, Jamaica, in Thailand, in places where this is an altogether other society. Why would we assume that a justice system is this cut and paste, one size fits all? And yet, this is the legacy of colonialism and later globalization. This is the one of the Thai women's prisons. I went to Thailand to look specifically at the plight of incarcerated women. And I went there for a couple reasons. One is that Thailand represents, in many ways, the sort of deadly cocktail of women and incarceration, and that is women, drugs, the drug war, and mass incarceration. Women are the fastest rising prison population, globally speaking, and Thailand is the sort of epitome of that. Of the 25,000 convicted women in Thailand, 21,000 of them are in for drug offenses, 18,000 of them for at least 20 years on drug offenses. The Thai war on drugs, which happened in about 2003, 2004, which was spurred on, of course, by our war on drugs, directly impacted women especially, because women were and are the foot soldiers in most drug wars. And particularly when you're talking about a country where certain gender rules are such that if your partner or your boyfriend asks you to carry this knapsack from here to there, you do it. You're going to see large swathes of the female population impacted in dreadful ways, and especially if they don't know the extent of the law, if they don't have access to lawyers. This should all actually sound familiar because it's no different here. It's simply an exaggerated version of what we have here. And I think, in the good bulk there's lots of statistics around the number of women who have co-defendants. Of those co-defendants, 80% of them are partners. So these are not the great gang, drug rulers of Thailand. These are the foot soldiers. The Princess of Thailand is quite passionate about this issue, and so, which is the other reason I went to Thailand specifically, to look at what she's created there, these model prisons. And this is one of them. She built something called the Kamlang Jai Project, which means inspire. So she has the women doing yoga. Here they're doing origami. She's built these kind of quote-unquote model prisons. Now, she also is the architect of the Bangkok Rules, which are kind of the equivalent of the standard minimum rules, which are now called the Mandela Rules, around really basic things with women and incarceration, like their right to sanitary pads and other, really basic things that she's pushing for. So clearly you can tell that this is another sort of Band-Aid, and yet here you have someone in a very powerful position, at least attempting to bring this front and center into the community. And speaking of dreadful, so this is another one that looks like, this is anywhere USA, it's anywhere worldwide, really. And that's, again, no accident. Essentially, prison history is a series of American inventions being foisted upon the world, and this is another one of them. This is the Supermax. Solitary confinement is a practice that was invented in the US, in Eastern State Penitentiary, right? Penitents, monks, solitary, give them a Bible, put them in a room, and they will repent. And solitary confinement in its most extreme form exists in Supermax prisons, where you have quote unquote the worst of the worst rotting away in cells for 22 hours a day. This is a supermax in Catanduvas, Brazil, which has the fastest rising prison population in the Americas. This thing cost $18 million US to build. It costs $120,000 US a year to incarcerate someone in it. If you've seen anything about Brazil in the news lately, aside from the corruption trials, you've seen that it is under extreme financial distress. And yet here we have these monstrosities being built, 5 of them around the country, allegedly for the worst of the worst. My time in there, what I discovered is that the worst of the worst could mean, and I saw one young man who looked no older than 16, and I asked someone, what is that child doing here? And they said he spit in the prosecutor's face. And I thought, well, if I were subject to that system as a poor young black man in Brazil, I'd probably spit in the prosecutor's face too. But here he is in solitary confinement for 3 years so far. So what is deemed the worst of the worst is not always what we think it is. And to visit any kind of supermax or solitary unit is to see madness before your eyes, is to see people, all of the studies that have been done enacted before your eyes in unbelievable ways that really take you to a new sense of depression, really, about what it is we are doing when we respond to harm with profound harm that is often irreparable. This is another prison that resembles the same old. This is also an Eastern State Penitentiary modeled prison. It is in Fremantle, Western Australia. And this is a museum now. But I went to Australia to look at sort of another aspect of our exportation process, and that is the exportation of the private prison industry. The private prison industry was invented as a concept here in the US and was, like these other practices, exported globally, such that we have the largest ones, but Britain is not far behind. And I went out to Western Australia to look at where the largest percentage of people in private prisons, 20% of Australia's prison population's in private prisons, 100% of its immigration deportation system is private. Now, what does that say for one, as a harbinger of what could come for us in terms of the increased deportations that are happening, but also Australia's increasingly xenophobic policies around immigration. It's no accident that there are a lot of people making serious money off of this. And there are other ways. I mean, Australia in many ways is I often think of it as a grotesque caricature of the US in its addiction to incarceration and punitiveness, in its war on drugs, and particularly in its war on people of color. The Aboriginal incarceration rate is staggering. It actually dwarfs even the rates around African Americans in the US, which is equally staggering and horrifying. But ultimately, indigenous peoples make up 2% of the population and almost 30% of the prison population. In Western Australia, 50% of the juvenile population is Aboriginal. I mean, this is clearly a system that is designed for social. There's no way to interpret those statistics otherwise. And in fact, the Aboriginal Act was the model for apartheid. So you start to see this global web of the same thing, the same process of basically criminalize a group, as we did here in the US with the Black Codes, mass incarcerate them, and usually then, as a result of that, produce a labor force out of them. Which certainly happened in Brazil with the coffee industry, in South Africa with the mining industry, the gold. All of this is this sort of terrifying trilogy of otherness, capitalism, mass incarceration. And in some respects, the second to last country that I spent time in is an absolute manifestation of that, and that's Singapore. I went to Singapore actually to look at something that I'd heard good things about. Now, probably when I say Singapore, you associate it with not such good things, i.e. caning. the practice of caning, which is still used, the incredibly draconian laws, not only around drugs, although the first thing you notice when you land in Singapore is what it says on your landing card, which is death to drug traffickers under Singaporean law. But also its draconian laws around things like chewing gum, eating durian fruit on the subway, all things you can end up with fines for. What was interesting to me about Singapore, though, was its approach to reentry, this practice of reentry. How do we get people back into the world after we incarcerate them? And Singapore, which has one of the lowest recidivism rates in the world, it's around 20%, whereas most of the world tends to hover in the 60s. Singapore finds jobs for 99% of people coming home from prison, finds them jobs before they come home, has corporate sponsorships from major organizations that guarantee hire of formerly incarcerated individuals. And they also have something called the Yellow Ribbon Project, which is basically, and this is an example of one of its ad campaigns, it's about sensitizing the public to the needs and the plight of the formerly incarcerated, and encouraging employers to hire them, encouraging people to accept them. And so this is one of the ads. They also have TV ads. They also have Yellow Ribbon Month every September, concerts. It's quite a powerful campaign that I think we can learn a lot from, actually, and it's sort of surprising to me that we've never had anything similar here in this country. But overall, I get into this in the book, so I won't get into detail here. It's not all roses and kumbaya. Singapore has very deliberate and very capitalistic reasons for its approach to reentry. But at the same time, I think it certainly raises plenty that we could potentially learn from in thinking about how to create an effective reentry instead of what we currently do, which is create barriers and obstacles at every turn for individuals coming home from prison. So the last country, and I'll wrap up with it, is, yes, this is a prison. It's in Norway, and it's on Bastøy Island. If any of you saw Michael Moore's more recent documentary, he filmed in Bastøy. A lot of people have been looking at Bastøy, especially in the past couple years, because Norway is often seen as a model of criminal justice, its ethos in criminal justice. And in many ways it is. There are no utopias. I emphasize that again and again. Nobody has the answer. There is no the answer. But there are many things that are very striking about Norway's system that I find myself reiterating a lot when people talk about inspiring things that we've seen. And one of them is this, which is an open prison. The individuals who are incarcerated here on all levels of crimes can come and go to work jobs on the outside, spend time with family, and have home leave, have work leave. So it's a porous prison. It's also quite an extreme version of that. It's like an ecological sanctuary. It's very beautiful, as you can see. But this concept of the open prison is not unique to Norway. It exists throughout Scandinavia. It exists in Germany, in the Netherlands. I have seen versions of it in Australia. So this possibility of being able to maintain a porous wall instead of that hard and fast one that blocks people off and makes reentry impossible, destroys communities and families, is quite an inspiring concept. But even beyond the open prison notion, I also visited Halden, which is known as the IKEA prison. It's a very beautiful, high-tech, incredible prison, but it's more traditional. It's got a wall, and the folks in there cannot come and go. Even in there, what struck me was the staff, the corrections officers. I didn't have time to get into detail, but obviously in my journey, I spent a lot of time, and I spend a lot of time at New York prisons talking to corrections officers and thinking about who do we hire as corrections officers? How do we train our corrections officers? Well, in Norway, you spend 2 years in a staff training academy studying philosophy, law, social work. It's incredibly competitive, thousands of people applying for a few hundred slots. And everyone I met in the system in Norway was unbelievably thoughtful around these issues. And they kept saying this word to me again and again, relations, relations. This is about being like an educator. And they are called by their first names, and they share with the individuals who are in the prisons. And those relations are what produce genuine improvement in human beings and create for genuine opportunities. So that's one of the, I mean, there are other things about Norway that are relevant. Certainly it's one of the least unequal places in the world. Therefore, it has a lower crime rate as opposed to US, South Africa, Brazil, places of extreme income inequality. So surely that is a major factor here. But I mean, so ultimately, I think some of the greatest takeaways that I carry with me through having taken the journey, continuing to talk about it, continuing to engage with communities and work in prisons, both in the US and internationally. Number one is that I certainly identify myself as an abolitionist. I believe that we have to, what is made can be unmade. Prisons, as many people imagine them to be having always been there, always will, that is not the case. They have a history. And I do think there will be a time when we look back and say, what were we doing? That was both not only disgustingly ineffective and expensive, but disgustingly inhumane, all of these things together. And so I think that what we need to do ultimately is use our radical imagination to rethink our approach to community safety in ways that are bigger than this structure altogether. The idea that we just have one, basically the world has one exclusive response to crime should strike everyone as just irrational. Even if it doesn't tug at your moral heartstrings, it should tug at your sense of what is just intellectually ridiculous. I think we certainly need to think globally around both problems and solutions to recognize the impact of our deeds as America. I often think, well, we made this mess. It is our duty, it is incumbent upon us to participate in the cleaning up of it to some capacity, but also to be open to the solutions that come in unexpected places, whether it's Rwanda or this pocket of South Africa or a pocket of Singapore, to think globally around these solutions, and to remain conscious and vigilant. I'll stop there. I'm sure there's a lot to say about the current administration and the trajectory of where we're going with all of this, but I'll be happy to hear from all of you. So thank you.
Baz, thank you very much. Got time for a couple of questions. If anyone has one, please raise your hand. Yes, ma'am.
You didn't mention human trafficking, and I was thinking about what part that might have played, especially in the Asian, Thailand and places like that, where the women were used for drug carrying. Were many of them used as human traffic victims too?
Yes, although I think they were. The bulk of the women in Thailand who are local Thai women are used for more local routes. But nowadays, I mean, that's certainly true. I was just actually, I was in Hong Kong in the prisons, and there I encountered women from all over, from Eastern Europe, from Russia, from parts of West Africa, who are in prison in Hong Kong. So I think you're more likely actually to find women from Eastern Europe and those parts of the world in the Asian countries and in other countries because of trafficking than necessarily the foreigners in the South. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Right back here, a question. Here comes the microphone at you. Come on. Right there.
I was curious about faith-based initiatives in prison, both in the U.S. and overseas. What role do you see that they play? Is it trusting? Is it working? And how do you feel about that?
Great question, especially as from here I actually fly to Denver to meet with Prison Fellowship International, which is a massive faith-based Christian organization, and probably the only organization that has its tentacles all around the globe. So I talk about some of the faith-based stuff in the chapter on South Africa because the program that I was part of there is a Christian one. And all around the world, what I have found is that in many countries where this issue is not remotely on the public radar, the only people doing the work are faith-based organizations. And so, you know, I'm pretty transparent about my own sort of agnostic beliefs. I am not religious, but I have been involved in a prison context with many religious organizations, and I have some parts of me that are, you know, I'm quite ambivalent about it. On the one hand, I'm not a fan of proselytizing, and especially those who are in dire straits, needy. On the other hand, I'm a fan of giving people hope in whatever capacity, and I'm certainly a fan of, if you're in there doing the work, then we're allies. And I grapple with that in the book, and I think that's a very real thing, but I've been very conscious of that, especially globally.
Yes, ma'am, right here. Question. Microphone coming at you.
Great, thank you very much. So you mentioned Singapore and its reentry approach. That's a very, I mean, I lived there before. It's a very small community, very easily controlled. What do you think is applicable and not applicable from, you know, from what you've seen?
Yeah. What is applicable is the hiring practices. It is amazing to me that we don't have job fairs in prisons while people are incarcerated. There are sometimes information fairs, this or that, but I'd like to see a line of employers going into prison to hire people before they come home and lining up jobs for them and doing interviews and encountering this, you know, this population at that stage of the game, so people don't have to come home with 5 cents in their pocket and scramble. So to me, that's like number one, no-brainer. The other one is just corporate involvement in this issue altogether. I went to this brunch at Changi Prison in Singapore, and I sat there with the CEO of Marina Bay Sands and, you know, other like heavy-pocketed individuals who are involved in this. And again, I'm not suggesting it's all for wonderful altruistic reasons, but the corporate sector is invested in having a safe community and invested in seeing people get jobs and be able to be, you know, functionally put food on the table. And I think we could certainly see more of that here. And then lastly, as I was saying, I think that the campaign around reaching the masses with a message of these are human beings and we are in this together, so embrace your fellow human beings, is one that we haven't really managed to do on a national level in any capacity, or even, as far as I know, a state or city level. And I'm in New York City, where theoretically, you know, incredibly progressive.
I know there are more questions, but we also want to allow time for you to visit with Baz personally and sign the book. I want to make some special introductions. First of all, I think he really needs no introduction, but maybe certainly one of the most progressive young leaders in the Arkansas legislature, and someone that we're proud that represents Little Rock. Welcome, Representative Clark Tucker. And what she's doing on the international level, there's a doctor in Little Rock who is doing it Arkansas level. The great work he's doing with the UAMS College of Public Health, working on incarceration. We've had the pleasure of working with him here at the Clinton School, but he really is, in my opinion, one of the most enlightened voices on this topic. And he's right here in Arkansas by way of Johns Hopkins and Brown University, and that's Dr. Nick Zoller. Nick, raise your hand back there. And the final one that makes Dean Hoffpower and I very proud is that we have a Clinton School student who last summer worked for the African Prisons Project. He's getting a concurrent degree in law. He worked on that prison in Uganda, with that prison in Uganda. Welcome Andrew Trevino right here, right here.